Thank you. On Tuesday, the 5th of June, 1900, the London Evening Standard reported with disappointment that no striking additions had been made to the Zoological Society's menagerie since the Easter bank holiday, but added that the old favourites came in for their full share of attention and admiration. Amongst these favourites, the reporter considered the display of cassowaries. Large black flightless birds with colourful heads and necks, cassowaries were a popular feature of menageries and zoological collections throughout the 19th and 20th centuries that enthralled audiences with their unpredictable tempers and delightful habit of kicking. The reporter concluded how it was scarcely possible to move in the ostrich house, where the visitors gathered to see not the societies, but rather Mr. Rothschild's fine collection of cassowaries. Naturalist and private collector Lionel Walter Rothschild became a Fellow of the Zoological Society of London in 1888, and by 1900 his zoological activities were deeply entwined with those of the Society. Expected to join the family bank, N.M. Rothschild & Sons, he instead devoted his life to the study of zoology and accumulated one of the largest zoological collections ever assembled by a single individual in his purpose-built museum in Tring in Hertfordshire. Yet the museum formed only one part of a much larger zoological enterprise. This museum housed itself both a research and public collection. It regularly published its own zoological journal, Novitati Zoologicae. Rothschild employed 2 professional curators and fostered a global network of collectors. However, alongside all of this, he also maintained what the press dubbed a private zoo, where he studied the habits and behaviours of animals, not just their anatomy and taxonomy. This private zoo was rather unusual in character, as it was not restricted to a single geographical location. Rather, it was spread over 3 sites: the family estate at Tring Park, the business premises of taxidermist Frederick Doggett in Cambridge, and in the Zoological Gardens in Regent's Park. Each site gave Rothschild privileged access to living animals which informed his scientific investigations, but my paper today will focus only on the latter site and examine Rothschild's use of the public zoological gardens to advance his own private zoological enterprise. I will explore how this was enabled through the process of depositing and Rothschild's subsequent entanglements with the Society's day-to-day operations. I argue that Rothschild's use of the public zoological gardens and access to living specimens played a pivotal, if under-recognised, role in establishing Rothschild's scientific authority, particularly on the species of cassowaries, but also in enabling the broader success of his zoological enterprise. However, this arrangement had significant limitations for the Society, as Rothschild's private ambitions collided with their long-term strategic goals. In exploring these themes, I hope to pose broader questions about the value of the zoo, both private or otherwise, as a site for studying taxonomy, but also of the importance of individuals like Rothschild in the history of the Zoological Society of London. So I know we've heard some of this today, but to recap, pursuing the vision of its first president, Sir Stamford Raffles, the Zoological Society opened the Zoological Gardens in Regent's Park to its members in 1828. Raffles had long advocated for their creation to allow fellows to conduct scientific research and to contribute to the growing field of natural history. However, from their inception, the Society faced an ongoing difficulty in keeping the gardens well stocked with animals, as many succumbed to a range of diseases and accidents and lived only short lives, as we heard in Dan's paper yesterday. In 1866, for example, mortality rates approached 33% of the total animal population per year, and that number hadn't improved by 1900. The preservation and acquisition of animals therefore became a significant preoccupation for the Society throughout much of the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly after the Society began admitting paying members of the public to the garden in 1847. Ooh. We might have a page missing, folks. We do. Okay, we're going to wing it. So, we'll go on to depositing. So, depositing was one of 5 methods of acquisition which was used by the Zoological Society in the 19th century for acquiring new animals. This was presentation, purchase, breeding, exchange, and depositing. In 1900, for example, 586 animals were presented, 247 were purchased, 94 were bred, and 26 were exchanged. However, by far the most prevalent form of acquisition was deposit, with 994 animals received through this method. Unlike the presentation and exchange of animals, which implied a permanent transfer of rights over the animal, depositing was a temporary measure, somewhat like a loan. The society gained the animal, but the depositor retained ownership. There's no evidence to suggest that the society incurred any legal obligations with regard to deposited animals. It was also not part of a formal replacement policy, and there is nothing to suggest that an animal was replaced like for like. The society were reacting to opportunities that were presented to them. They were likely to favour, as we've heard in other papers throughout the conference, large, valuable and charismatic species which would attract the crowds and thus admission fees, like the cassowaries that I introduced at the beginning of the paper. But smaller, new and unusual species would have equally increased the diversity of species on display within the zoo. So with the animal trade being both speculative and competitive, depositing offered another way of securing animals which the society might not otherwise have obtained, either because of prohibitive costs or market competition. Now, depositing was a constant source of specimens throughout the 19th century, as you can see in this graph here, but it surged in popularity between 1900 and 1907. Deposits were made by a range of individuals. The royal family were particularly prevalent in this, receiving gifts from other nations, and they were deposited in the zoo. Exotic pet owners were another frequent source, particularly birds and apes, which were coming from women who found them uncontrollable or they no longer fit in with their lifestyle. But of course, fellows were another regular source. For fellows, depositing not only fulfilled their obligations to the society and contributed to the success of the gardens, but it also offered a means of housing and studying these animals, and particular species of personal interest, when they lacked either the inclination or the facilities to do so on their own estates. Now, the most prolific depositor and fellow was Walter Rothschild. Evidence of Rothschild's deposits can be found throughout the Society's daily occurrences and the registers of deaths in the menagerie, and they began in 1888 when he became a fellow, and they only ended with his death in 1937. Now, if we take 1900 as an example, Rothschild deposited approximately 779 animals in the zoo, a selection of which is shown on the slide here. This means that Rothschild was responsible for at least 78% of the animals received on deposit in 1900, which in turn is roughly 40% of the overall additions made to the Zoological Society that year. So if I do a further calculation, it means that circa 1900, an estimated 25% of animals on display in the zoo at any one time could have belonged to Walter Rothschild. Clearly, he was a significant figure in ensuring that the society boasted a well-stocked menagerie. But Rothschild was motivated by more than societal obligation, and as we shall see, the scale of this entanglement created a number of tensions. So Rothschild's acts of depositing were underpinned by his motivation to advance his own zoological endeavours. Firstly, the zoo was provided suitable alternative accommodation for his animals once he was no longer able to keep them on his estate at Tring Park. This happened after an incident in 1888 where his father was supposedly attacked by a free-roaming cassowary while riding his horse, and the number of animals on the estate was reduced, many transferred to London Zoo. Now, the fact that Rothschild became a fellow that same year the timing of that would seem really coincidental. I think not, rather that he became a fellow in order to take greater license of using the ability to deposit his animals in the zoo. But more than just acting as an overflow, the display of his living animals in the public zoological garden mirrored his ambition for his own zoological museum. Rothschild was really motivated by a desire to educate and excite the public about nature. His museum was open to the public on certain days and at certain times, and it was the zoo offered him another venue in which to invite people in and to see the nature that he was so excited by. Unsurprisingly, therefore, the zoo did serve as a pipeline for the specimens to Rothschild's museum. His ongoing ownership meant that when the animals eventually died, he was able to claim their bodies to, quote, enrich his museum at Tring. And this is evidenced by the methods of disposal listed in the registers of deaths in the menagerie, which Dan talked to us about yesterday. What's interesting is Rothschild even issued the society with instructions as to which taxidermist should receive which animal for preparation. So on the 6th of February 1900, for example, a moccasin snake and common boa were returned to Rothschild via the Brighton-based taxidermist Brasener Brothers, which was in keeping with instructions which he reissued in 1904 when he ordered that the cassowaries be sent to Doggett in Cambridge, that Joseph Cullingford of Durham was to receive all the other birds, lizards and snakes were destined for Brasener Brothers, and mammals, tortoises, frogs and newts to Edward Gerard down in Camden Town. The society then acted as caretakers of living animals until such a time as they perished and could make the transition into Rothschild's museum's collections. But finally, and I would say most significantly, the Zoological Gardens provided Rothschild with a place in which to observe and study living animals, work which informed his own taxonomic research, and none more so than in the case of cassowaries. Rothschild's interest in cassowaries developed in the 1890s when he looked for specimens to display in his museum. But at that same time, he committed to writing a monograph on ratites for the German Zoological Society and became particularly struck by the inadequate figures and descriptions hitherto available of cassowaries and decided it might be useful if he published a monograph with coloured figures and detailed anatomical descriptions. Rothschild's aim for this monograph, which was published in 1900 in collaboration with the zoologist W.P. Pycraft, was to determine the species and geographical races of these birds, work which he concluded would only be possible through access to and first-hand observations of live cassowaries. Rothschild felt that previous work to classify the species and subspecies of cassowary had been hampered by taxonomists' predominant study of dead specimens, in which the disappearance of death of the most characteristic coloration and structure of the bare skin on the head and neck had resulted in limited knowledge of the species. Rothschild therefore set out to acquire as complete a collection alive as possible of the cassowaries to aid his work, and many of these birds were housed within the Zoological Gardens of the Zoological Society of London. So in the zoo, Rothschild was able to compare birds, live birds, side by side, and use his observations of the different colorations and behaviours of particular birds to dispute the descriptions of previous zoologists and describe many new subspecies. In 1899, for example, Rothschild challenged ornithologist Tommaso Salvadori and asserted, quote, "This is not right. Though I cannot blame Count Salvadori for his decision, as he only had dead specimens to compare. Anyone who saw the two birds alive and side by side, as I have done, would not hesitate a moment to say they were a separate geographical race." The naming of species was a form of social capital in the 19th century, and Rothschild's naming of new forms of cassowaries demonstrated his apparent taxonomic expertise and contributed to his emerging status as an authority on these birds. The zoo then functioned not just as a source of cadavers for Rothschild, but as a repository of the living evidence which supported his taxonomic conclusions. Now, Rothschild's work on cassowaries has subsequently come under scrutiny, but during his lifetime, his means to acquire and study large numbers of living cassowaries enabled him to make what contemporaries perceived to be a significant contribution to zoology. Zoologist R.I. Pocock described Rothschild as the greatest living authority on the cassowary, and the monograph as a standard on the species. And Rothschild owed this status to his live birds, the keep of which was enabled by his fellowship of and relationship with the Zoological Society and its gardens. But as with any good story, there are two sides to every one. Now, Rothschild's prolific depositing had significant reciprocal benefits for the society. As suggested earlier, animals received on deposit helped mitigate the effects of high mortality rates and ensure that displays remained well stocked and appealing to visitors. Even if the deposited animal was only on display for a few months or even days, Deposited animals offered novel attractions, and indeed the rapid turnover may have encouraged repeat visits and thus increased revenue as audiences returned to see the latest new arrival. But crucially, depositing enabled the society to acquire new animals with minimal financial outlay, a significant benefit given that it turned only a minimal profit each year. What's more, Rothschild was also prepared to help pay for the upkeep of his animals. In 1898, he made the first of 2 payments of £150 towards the construction of a new tortoise house, which was built largely in part to house some of the 50 Galapagos tortoises he'd procured through the Harris-Webster expedition and had deposited in the gardens. Evidently then, Rothschild was prepared to invest in the zoo in multiple ways, leaving a legacy in the built landscape and not just on its financial fortunes. However, this was not a contribution to the society openly acknowledged, and in fact, in 1900, the society appeared to congratulate itself for reducing acquisition costs while raising animal numbers, the annual report noting that expenditure on new animals had reduced from some £1,700 to £1,800. Given that Rothschild was depositing 3 times as many animals as the society were buying, it seems highly unlikely that there was, in fact, a reduced need for them to use their own funds to secure new acquisitions. This is just one example of the tensions that began to emerge as Rothschild's depositing entangled him with the society's day-to-day operations. Underpinning these tensions was the fact that depositors retained ownership of the animals, and consequently they were able to exert influence over their future management, leaving the society with a lack of direct control over a large number of animals in their care. In January 1899, for example, Rothschild wrote to Assistant Superintendent Arthur Thompson to request that he find room to display 13 of his cassowaries, Rothschild noting that, "I do not want to kill them, so I want you to try and arrange and exhibit them in the zoo, or at least put them in a place where they can have runs. Of course, it is useless for you to have them if you shut them up in boxes. Please see Dr. Slater about it and let me know as soon as possible." Slater responded by denying the request, which only prompted a reply from Rothschild in which he confirmed having issued instructions directly to Thompson to dispose of all existing stock and replace it with his own. This is a clear example of the tension between Rothschild's private ambitions and the society's management of its own gardens. A further example of these tensions can be found when we look at the impact of depositing on the society's efforts to address high animal mortality rates. While the study of living animals was important to Rothschild, it ultimately did not matter to him whether an animal lived 3 weeks or 3 years, so long as it was eventually added to either his research or public collections. This conflicted with the aims of the society, which had grown increasingly concerned with the underlying causes of ill health in their animals and had arranged for more frequent post-mortems to be undertaken by the society's preceptor. Post-mortem investigation was, however, invasive and often incompatible with the methods of preparation favoured by naturalists and taxidermists who wanted to keep the skin as intact as possible. Rothschild was a naturalist, and the vast majority of his animals were sent directly to the taxidermist without any investigation, thereby preventing the society from expanding their knowledge about animal disease and, by extension, the care that might be provided to extend their life expectancy. Moreover, Rothschild's actions exacerbated the existing problem. In 1900, the Society's preceptor was forced to explain that the rise in the number of deaths, which had increased that year by 440 animals to a total of 1,557, was the result of, quote, a large number of small reptiles received on deposit, and made none other than by Walter Rothschild. In fact, around a third of the animals which died in 1900 were deposited by Rothschild between 1893 and 1900, which is some 519 animals. This therefore created a conundrum for the society. Their relationship with Rothschild helped to keep the zoo populated with a range of animals for public view, yet by depositing animals in such large numbers, he inadvertently contributed to the problem they were trying to combat. Depositing may have come at no financial cost to the society, but it cost them both strategically, owing to the lack of control it gave them over the animal body. For For the Zoological Society then, the significant involvement of one particular fellow both benefited and constrained its activities. The zoological gardens became a dynamic place of animal ownership, where animals did not always belong to the society, but there was a large variety on display, acquired at minimal financial cost. However, Rothschild's motivations for depositing in the animals in the zoo were often at odds with those of the society, despite his status as a fellow. Rothschild was pursuing his own private agenda, one where the zoo housed the living evidence that informed his taxonomic classifications, and thereby underpinning his authority and reputation amongst his contemporaries, particularly in the case of cassowaries. The zoo then played a pivotal, if under-recognised, role in establishing Rothschild's scientific authority and enabling the broader success of his zoological enterprise. However, that relationship, and particularly the temporary arrangements involved in depositing, in which the society gained possession but not ownership of the animals, left them relatively powerless against the demands and expectations of Rothschild, who had very different priorities. This was particularly evident in the society's efforts to reduce its animal mortality rates, for they were often prevented from investigating an animal's cause of death and learning lessons from it that could help prevent future occurrences. Rothschild and his acts of depositing were vital for keeping the zoological gardens populated with animals during this period, but they simultaneously undermined the long-term strategic goals of the society. Thank you.